Welcome back to Things You Don't Know, the podcast where we take the stories you thought you understood and turn them inside out.
Today, ladies and gentlemen, we're taking the American Revolution and placing it back into its proper scale because after 1778, it stopped being only an American conflict.
Most people picture a militia, redcoats, Washington, and winter camps.
The traditional image of snow, muskets, soldiers without shoes, and a very cold Christmas.
And once France entered the war in 1778, the struggle widened across the Atlantic and far beyond it.
And France did not join out of pure idealism.
No, it was very much the enemy of my enemy is my friend. France wanted to weaken Britain and avenge losses from the Seven Years' War. That alliance transformed a minor colonial rebellion into a global imperial conflict.
And even before France entered, the war already had an international dimension.
Because of the Hessians.
Right, Hessians is the shorthand, but Britain was using troops from several German principalities after being turned down by Catherine the Great for Cossacks. Several German principalities, especially Hesse-Cassel. These were not random mercenaries in the modern sense. They were forces supplied through formal state agreements.
That reflected Britain's broader European alliance system, including the Hanoverian connection.
So even before France joined, this was already more than just a local uprising.
Half the German princes were connected to George III one way or another. But once French money, French troops, and especially French naval power entered the picture, this war became unmistakably international.
Hey, let's take a little trip to the south, Dr. Deneen, and take a look at the Caribbean. Yeah, maybe you can see that one of the most important theaters was the Caribbean.
Absolutely, Dr. Weaver, which many people do not expect.
Because of our location, modern memory centers the war on the future United States and, in a limited extent, to Canada. But 18th century policymakers in the British Empire cared just as intently, if not more, about the Caribbean because of sugar. Sugar colonies were extremely wealthy, and they could be far more economically valuable than the mainland colonies.
Boy, sugar has just plagued mankind for a long time, hasn't it?
It sure has.
So, anyhow, these islands were tied to plantation wealth, trade, customs revenue, shipping, and finance. Jamaica, in particular, was enormously important to Britain.
So, Britain is not just asking how to hold New York or how to hold Charleston. It is also asking how to defend its wealthiest imperial possessions.
Chandler, you're exactly right. Once France entered the war, and the next year Spain followed in 1779, the Caribbean became a major arena of naval warfare, island seizures, convoy protection, and all sorts of imperial competition.
And, this matters directly to the American story. Fighting in the Caribbean forced Britain to divide its ships, troops, and attention. It could not concentrate everything on crushing the rebellion in North America.
So even battles fought far away from the colonies affected American independence.
Very much so. The clearest example is the battle we think is the end at Yorktown. French naval strategy, French and Haitian sailors and troops in the Caribbean shaped the choices that made that campaign possible. When Admiral de Grasse sailed north to the Chesapeake in 1781, French sea power helped to trap Cornwallis.
Yeah, that that's for sure. So the road to Yorktown did not run only through Virginia. It also ran through the Caribbean.
But Britain did not simply fail there either.
No, when you look at the non-American aspects of the war, Britain proved very resilient. The Battle of the Seientes in 1782 was a major British naval victory and helped preserve Jamaica from a serious combined Franco-Spanish threat.
Yeah, and that is an important reminder. Britain lost the 13 colonies. Yeah, that's true. But it did not lose everything. In the Caribbean, it defended some of its most valuable imperial interests.
And we should also say plainly that this wealth rested on slavery.
Absolutely, Cheney. There's no getting away from that. The importance of the Caribbean cannot be separated from plantation slavery and the exploitation that made those colonies so profitable. It's not frequently known, but 35 to 40% of the slaves imported from Africa went to the Caribbean. Only 8% went to the United States.
Now let's move east. What does the American Revolution have to do with India, Dr. Weaver?
Well, a whole bunch. Once we stop thinking in national boxes, we can see that.
Absolutely, India was already a major arena of British-French rivalry. This was not a new competition created by the revolution, but the widening of the war gave both powers another opportunity to contest each other's influence there.
Yeah.
And this is not just a simple European struggle transplanted overseas.
That's correct. India was politically complex with 13 major regional powers within the subcontinent pursuing their own interests. Britain and France operated through state subsidized companies, which were run like countries in some ways, port treaties, alliances, and military and political diplomacy with a dozen Indian states.
Wow. A very complex system, right, Dr. Deneen?
Too complex to explain somewhat. It's worth a podcast of its own.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so Britain, Britain's position was tied closely to the East India Company. Now, we've all heard about that. But what was it? Well, by this time, it was far more than just a commercial business. It was a military and territorial force.
So, Britain in India is already becoming something much bigger than trade.
Yes, can you imagine a country run by a corporation? Revenue, territory, and political influence are all becoming central. France still had influence, particularly in the northern Indian provinces, but Britain was in a much stronger long-term position.
Yes, and local powers mattered greatly here. Mysore, under Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan, became one of the most formidable opponents of British expansion in southern India.
So, when we say Britain and France fought through allies, we are talking about a complicated regional struggle, not just a simple European duel.
So it was kind of a proxy war sometimes, right, Chandler?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
It's very important to remember that Indian rulers were not passive background figures. They were strategic actors playing European powers off against each other and pursuing their own goals.
Yes. The fighting involved land campaigns, sieges, alliances, and naval competition in the Indian Ocean. We forget about all that stuff so much at the time.
We certainly do. And that naval dimension is easy to overlook. The French Admiral Suffren seriously challenged British power in the Indian Ocean. His grandson is one of Napoleon's great admirals. So again, this was not just an Atlantic war with distant aftershocks elsewhere.
Britain is being stretched across multiple theaters. Isn't that right, Dr. Weaver?
Yes, it is, Chandler. And, you know, yet somehow it still does not collapse. That says a lot about Great Britain.
There's a reason they ruled 40% of the world at one time, but that's the key, the Asian possessions. The war in India was dangerous and very expensive, but the long-term results still favored Britain. The East India Company emerged from this era in a stronger position than France, and British influence in India continued to expand.
So even while Britain loses the 13 colonies, it is laying the foundations for a more Asia-centered imperial future.
Precisely.
All right, now here is the big question. Did Britain lose the war?
Well, yes, in America, yes, it lost the 13 colonies for sure.
But globally, the answer is much more complicated. Britain lost an important part of its empire, yet preserved much of its naval strength, held on to Canada and vital Caribbean interests, and remained on a path toward greater power in India.
So not collapse.
No, transformation.
That's the better word. We call this period the end of the First British Empire and the beginning of the Second. The American Revolution was a defeat for Britain and North America, but not an all-encompassing imperial disaster. It forced Britain to rethink its imperial priorities, center itself more toward Asia and Africa. This is where you see the first settlers in what will become Rhodesia and South Africa as well. It it basically makes a great nation is forced to become even more globally strategic.
That is why this war matters beyond the United States. It was about constitutional crises in the colonies, yeah, but also about empire, trade, slavery, naval power, and the future balance of power across the world. And might I say that extended right up through modern times. The roots were laid here. Wouldn't you agree, Chandler?
I would agree with that, Dr. Weaver. And that's also why the label American Revolution can be a little bit misleading sometimes.
It's not wrong, it's just incomplete. If you want an interesting take on this, look at our Moses Hazen podcast for pro-American Canadians and their impact on the larger North American sovereignty issue.
Okay, we could go on for sure, but you know, the next time you think of the American Revolution,
Think of the Caribbean, where sugar wealth and naval warfare shaped the conflict.
And also think about India, where imperial rivalry and local alliances helped define the UK's future.
because by 1778, it was no longer just an American rebellion.
The best way to describe it, it was a world war in 18th century form, and the power that lost in America won everywhere else. One of history's ironies, friends.
Well, this has been Things You Don't Know.
Hey, listen, like, subscribe, share. I think if you talk to some people about this, it will surprise them.
As I always say, the version we got in the seventh grade wasn't entirely wrong either, but it was very incomplete. It was not one group of people on one side and one on the other. It was just as much as I've said before, a civil war is the one that happens in the 19th century, but now it was also a world war. So try to remember, folks, history is always broader and bigger and more complex than the version you were told.
Indeed. Bye for now.